Okay, thanks everyone for joining to our monthly UCNR water webinar. And today is our last webinar of this academic year. And after today, we'll take a short break and then we'll resume again in the fall. But for today, I'm really delighted and honored to host Dr. Hoori Ajami. Dr. Ajami is an assistant professor of groundwater hydrology at UC Riverside. She's an expert on surface water-groundwater interaction, climate change impact assessment, integrated hydrologic modeling, spatial analysis, and remote sensing. Her research focuses on trying to understand the mountain to valley aquifer systems and try to shed new light in terms of how atmosphere, groundwater, surface water, and the subsurface really interact using range of remote sensing and numerical modeling tool, along with incorporating isotopic data in her research. She received her PhD in hydrology from University of Arizona, and prior to joining UC Riverside, she was a postdoctoral fellow with National Center for Groundwater Research and Training in Australia, and a senior research associate at University of New South Wales, Australia. So it's very international perspective to the issues related to water and hydrology. So Hoori, take it away.
Thank you so much, Safiq, for a great introduction. It's been an honor to present for my UCANR colleagues and other water resources colleagues that are joining the webinar on a 3 p.m. on a Friday afternoon. Thank you so much. So today, actually, I'm not going to talk about any research from Australia. Most of it is going to focus on California with the drought that is looming over our heads. So it's a good timing to talk about how watersheds, in particular agricultural ecosystems, respond to drought and understand hydrologic processes from headwaters to groundwater. Before I continue on, I would like to acknowledge the contribution from my group members. Whatever I'm presenting today is the work of Dr. Adam Schreiner-McGrath, Dr. Juan Sebastian Acero Triana, and Arushi Jha, which was a master's student in my group. And also I would acknowledge my collaborators from various UC campuses and USDA ARS, where collaborators on these grants. So I appreciate Daniel Kayan, Dong Wang, Kurt Schwabi, and Ali Montazer. So without further ado, let's talk about our research. So all of you know that human activities have impacted our terrestrial ecosystems considerably. And actually we have created what we refer to as anthropogenic biomes. Here it shows the distribution of these biomes that consist of urban areas, croplands, pasture lands, and you can see majority of the Earth's surface actually have been modified by various human activities, and humans essentially are shaping ecosystem dynamics in addition to geology and climate. The impact of human activities on ecosystems have been to the extent that International Association of Hydrologic Sciences in 2013 called this new decade as Pantheria, a change in hydrology and society. So that means that the humans are an integral component of the ecosystems, and we are interested to study hydrologic processes. We cannot separate them from these investigations. Recent investigations of changing, looking at global land cover change around the globe shows that a third of the global land surface area has changed between 1960 to 2019. And most of these changes actually has not been a single change. Majority of the Earth's surface actually has been changing by conversions between agriculture or deforestation and so forth. So these changes haven't been non-uniform. At the same time, we have the global expansion of the cropland during this period by about 1 million square kilometers. While in some regions, they may have lost agriculture, and particularly in the southern hemisphere, we have had the expansion of agricultural activities, and in certain regions, even intensification of agriculture, because we have to provide food for the human population. And these changes in the land use hasn't been uniform temporarily either. While between 1960 to 2005, we have experienced increased rate of land cover change. In the past few decades, there have been a declining trend in change. And of course, there are certain hypotheses that what caused these declining trend. So here, the rising trend is mostly associated with the production and export of the commodity crops, increases in the oil prices, and expansion of agriculture in the southern hemisphere. And the decline actually was associated partly to the global financial crisis that happened in 2008 to 2009, as well as climate change and increases in extreme events such as droughts and floods. Among various different land cover types, in particular, we see changes in the global cropland area. So it's very dynamic. And the reason is that the global land cover areas essentially are impacted by water availability. So irrigated agriculture is a major water user and is the world's largest consumer of freshwater resources. And 40% of our food globally comes from irrigated agriculture. And the water source for irrigation either comes from surface water, groundwater, or both in some places. On average, across the US, about 65% of total groundwater withdrawals are used for irrigation. And also these irrigated systems, as I'll show you globally, even within the US, these systems have been very dynamic, and the rate of change in the area of irrigated land have been changing considerably, and mostly controlled by water supply and demand, economic conditions, agronomic conditions, and of course, climate change. But hydrologic predictions in the agro-ecosystem is challenging because their dynamics is very complex and is controlled not only by climate variability and water supply, but also by human activities, you know, what the farmers decide to grow in the next growing season, or what type of irrigation system they implement, what are the economic incentives or legal and economic consideration. That's what's make the predictions in agro-ecosystems very challenging. And of course, these dynamics between natural and human systems are also very complex, and is mostly controlled which types of water source is used for irrigation. For example, in humid systems, surface water resources are mostly used to supply irrigation demand if rainfall is not enough. However, in dry environment, groundwater is the main source of irrigation in many regions. But the problem with groundwater is that although it's a nice reserve, groundwater flows very slowly. And also groundwater systems has a long residence time. So any type of pumping activities or so forth, it takes a long time in some cases for groundwater to respond, whether it's changing in climate or pumping. So that's complicated assessing the impact of human activities on groundwater system. In areas such as California, where we have a seasonal climate, where we are using conjunctive use, part of the year we may rely on surface water resources to determine, you know, essentially to fulfill the demand. Compared to groundwater, the degree of this connectivity between surface water and groundwater systems becomes more important. And the issue of conjunctive water use becomes very important. If we map the global distribution of groundwater depletion, you would see that actually majority of these areas coincide with regions of irrigated agriculture, including California. And we are, as is shown here, majority of the groundwater depletion happened as a result of overpumping in this area. And this, coupled with changes in climate variability and increases intensity of the extreme events such as droughts. So this figure shows terrestrial water storage measurements from gray satellite. And as you can see here, in some cases, these red areas shows regions that experience groundwater depletion or surface water depletion, because this is total water storage. You could see that in some regions, such as California, we are experiencing groundwater depletion. This is not by the models, this is by satellite measurements. And also this depletion not only caused by human activities, but also by the recent droughts that we had in this region. Indeed, there was a paper published in 2020 that they used tree-ring data and hydrologic model to reconstruct soil moisture anomalies since 1800 until now. And they showed that there has been 5 mega droughts that happened since 800 CE in Southwest US. And unfortunately, our latest drought that we have in 2012 to 2015 was the second mega drought that happened on record. So this is alarming for water resources availability and variety of users that we have in California that reliant on both surface water and groundwater resources to meet industrial and agriculture and domestic water demand. But the question is, you see all of these drought investigation always comes to my mind. How do we define droughts? In the literature, there are different types of droughts. Meteorological drought that is caused by decline in precipitation, agricultural drought, decline in soil moisture, which essentially may result in crop failure, snow drought, groundwater drought, and even in recent years, the term anthropogenic drought, because it's not only natural processes that impact or results in generation of drought, human activities, overpumping of groundwater system could cause drought. So therefore, again, human systems are integral part of this defining even drought process. And if you look at the literature, various indices have been used to define droughts. For example, based on GRACE data, you have heard of Palmer Drought Severity Index, USDM, and so forth. And depending on which metric you use, as you can see, the intensity of the drought or even the spatial extent could be very different. One thing that we need to keep in mind that whether we are talking about meteorological drought or snow drought, hydrologic system is a connected system. So even if we have a meteorological drought is happening and it ending, it doesn't mean that the hydrologic system has recovered. And this is the message that I want to convey today using observational data and numerical experiments. So we know that meteorological droughts impact groundwater response. And our goal is to understand the time lag that it takes between precipitation drought to propagate to the groundwater system and understand what are the watershed properties that control this lag time. And more importantly, in terms of water management perspective, how long does it take for aquifers to recover from a drought? So to do that, we looked at the groundwater data from USGS Climate Response Network. There are about 600 wells in the area. These are the wells that are tapped into unconfined aquifers and are not impacted by human activities. As you can see, we don't have any in California because all the wells that we have already are impacted by pumping. So out of these data sets, we could select about 266 wells that had at least 10 years of observations. And our goal was to use the time series of groundwater level as well as precipitation data to detect drought. So we define drought as periods in precipitation anomalies that we have 3 years of negative anomalies less than -5%. We do the similar thing with the groundwater time series. As you can see here, there is a lag, and this is data between the start of the precipitation drought and the groundwater drought, as well as there is some sort of a lag when the precipitation drought ends and when groundwater drought ends. And then the next question is, what is the recovery? It will take also after the groundwater drought ends for the water levels to essentially get back to the pre-drought level. So we are talking about these metrics, which we refer to as time of rise. So in the next few slides, I'm going to talk about how this time of lag and time of recovery changing across the continental US. So on average, you would see that the time lag between precipitation drought and groundwater drought is about 20 months. About 2 years it takes, even when the precipitation drought starts, to propagate to the groundwater system. But across multiple wells, across the CONUS, this time lag could range between 1 to 185 months, meaning that 15 years. It may take about 15 years until you see the drought signal in groundwater. But majority of the wells have a short lag time, which is about 2 years. And this is partly actually biased by the lot of observation wells that are located in northeastern part of US. Since the climate is wetter, the lag time is shorter. As we move towards the western US, the lag time for drought to propagate to the groundwater becomes much longer. But then you ask the question, what controls this lag time? So we looked at 2 sets of properties, the drought properties and geographic properties. And of course, we used a random forest model to determine which of these factors play a more important role in controlling lag time of groundwater response. So our result shows that the drought intensity during the lag time has a major control. If you have a very severe drought, of course, the lag time would be shorter, and I will explain why. And the second thing is that mean annual recharge has more impact on the lag time of the groundwater. One surprising thing is that depth to water table doesn't have very high importance factor, and we are going to explore why. So we use the data from these 266 wells and develop these multiple regression models. Believe me, some magics with the data to show the correlations between the lag time and drought intensity and a set of geographic properties to see which properties actually controls the lag time more. As you can see in this figure, in areas that we have shallow water table, a strong land atmospheric interactions controls groundwater response to drought. If you move to regions that depth to water table is between 5 to 10 meters, drought intensity during the lag time impacts the response time. And this is also could partly be explained by the aquifer transmissivities. If your aquifers have higher transmissivity, their response time would be typically faster. And finally, if you have a very deep water table, besides drought intensity, aquifer hydraulic conductivity and recharge control groundwater lag time. So it's a very complex process and many factors interacting at the same time to control groundwater response to droughts. What about recovery? The drought happens, it may take on average a couple of years until you see the signal on groundwater, but as a water manager, we would care most, how long does it take for groundwater to recover? On average, across the continental US, it takes about 3 years for groundwater to recover from the drought. And as you would expect, the recovery time in the Western US is much longer compared to eastern part. However, 85% of the droughts, groundwater recover within 10 years. So this is such a long time. So drought might be ended, but the groundwater resources may not have recovered yet. And keep in mind, these recovery periods that we are estimating are in aquifers that are not impacted by human activities. So if we add the impact of pumping, those recovery time due to drought could be way longer. One thing also that we need to consider that the recovery process is not just happens right at a single point in time. The recovery is a process, you know, depending on changes in meteorological condition and recharge, it would take some time for groundwater to recover. So here we are showing different recovery pathways for the wells across the continental US. And as you could see in wells that the amount of recharge is very low, the recovery rate is slower compared to regions that we have higher recharge, not surprising. However, whether we are in an aquifer system that groundwater levels are deep or shallow, those also control which recovery pathway is going to be taken by that particular aquifer system. And how long does it take for moisture from the land surface essentially propagates and gets to the groundwater systems? What controls groundwater recovery time? Again, we went back to our machine learning models, develop a random forest model, and here it showed that, of course, if you have larger groundwater head loss during the drought, it takes much longer for the groundwater to recover. And this groundwater head loss essentially is controlled by the drought severity. Therefore, we would expect in future, as the intensity and severity of the drought events increase, it would take longer for the aquifers to recover. On the other hand, some people may argue that, well, the intensity or frequency of the floods may increase as well. Therefore, these processes may essentially offset each other. At this point, we cannot tell. We need numerical models to test these types of hypotheses. So here I showed you that the lag time could take up to 15 years between meteorological drought and groundwater drought. And depth to water table determines whether precipitation properties or geographic properties control the lag time. And the recovery is about 3 years and is mostly controlled by drought severity. Now let's move from the continental scale to California, our own state. We have experienced prolonged droughts, decline in a snowpack, and we have been using groundwater more. Here is the result from GRACE observations. All of you've seen this from the previous drought we experienced that showed high levels of groundwater depletion in California. But there are issues here in terms of characterizing groundwater response and recovery to droughts. First of all, we don't have long-term groundwater observations. The data is very sporadic. And most of the groundwater depletion happens in irrigated areas that we also do a lot of pumping for irrigation. So it's difficult to separate the impact of climate versus, pumping from the signals that we observe. But one thing that is important, if we are thinking about groundwater recovery, is that estimation of recharge, because groundwater recharge is a key in determining how this recovery process will take place. Unfortunately, groundwater recharge is one of the most difficult components of the water budget to quantify. The reason for that is majority of the land areas around the globe have recharge rates of less than 20 millimeters per year. And we often have a lot of uncertainty on our meteorological forcing to estimate our recharge. So if we don't have a good estimate of recharge, predictions of groundwater recovery also would be more complicated. And of course, depending on which global climate model we use, we don't know what is the future of recharge rate is going to be, because the precipitation estimate from these GCMs has high levels of uncertainty. But we don't give up. We're still interested in groundwater recharge partitioning. And here is the result from a study led by Tom Meixner in 2016 that they looked at major aquifers in the Western US, and our Central Valley Aquifer System is part of it as well. Based on existing observations, it seems majority of recharge in Central Valley is controlled by irrigation, but also recharge from mountain systems also play an important role on feeding the Central Valley Aquifer System. However, mountain system recharge is one of the processes that hasn't been studied well, and there is a lot of uncertainty on recharge estimate. And there are different definitions exist for this mountain system recharge. So here we come up with three main definitions for these total mountain system recharge. We could break it to three components. The first one, which I called mountain aquifer recharge, is the recharge that is result of infiltration of rain or snow through mountain bedrock. Part of this recharge may come as a stream discharge in the mountains, but part of it could be flowing deep through the mountain bedrock and leave the system as mountain block recharge. And then finally, we have mountain front recharge, which is a result of stream flow infiltration at the mountain front. At the moment, we don't know how much of these components coming out of the Sierra Nevada aquifer systems. And we all are developing, not the academia, the groundwater sustainability agencies developing these sustainability plans without knowing accurate estimate of recharge from mountain systems. So thankfully, we got an NSF funded project and the USDA ARS project to answer these questions. Why we are focusing on mountain system recharge, I often face this question, this is a small recharge amount. Why do you focus on that? Because that's the main sources of natural recharge, which depends on the snowpack. And the snowpack in Sierra Nevada has been changed considerably. Here is the result of the snow survey and some models and satellite data. I don't need to convince you guys that the Sierra Nevada snowpack has been declining, and particularly also this year. So God knows what happens to our water resources moving forward. But one of the challenge that we have in terms of characterizing this recharge and estimating it, which we are very much interested, is the uncertainty that we have in the gridded meteorological products. We don't have good precipitation estimates in the mountains. And if you are looking at different products that are commonly used in hydrologic modeling, like NLDAS2, PRISM, DayMet, GridMet, high uncertainty exists, particularly in the high elevation areas where our water towers are. So what do we do about it? We led an investigation by Adam to answer this question and hopefully come up with a solution. To do that, we focused on the Covilla River watershed in California. And I'm pleased to say that Covilla is now one of the SEEP watershed by NRCS, which is designated for Conservation Effect Assessment Project, meaning that we are interested to understand how changes in irrigation recharge impact groundwater system. And my lab group, we are using this Covilla watershed as an observatory to understand groundwater recharge processes from the headwaters to groundwater in this system. So we set up a hydrologic model for this area and use different types of precipitation forcing data to see how different precipitation data set impacts the water balance. So here is just the figure shows the mean annual precipitation for water year 2016 from NLDAS to PRISM, GridMet, and DayMet. We were initially thinking the issue is only with precipitation, but actually air temperature is not even better. Air temperature forcing also have lots of uncertainty. So we looked at the uncertainty on both precipitation and temperature on the water budget. The modeling framework that we use in my research group is called the power flow modeling package that was developed by Reed Maxwell and Stefan Colette. Is an integrated surface water, groundwater, atmospheric model. That's the cool thing about it. You could look at the impact of changes in groundwater level on wind speed. But don't attempt that because it takes such a long time for these modeling systems to run. So what we are focusing on in my group, looking at the surface water groundwater interaction. So we are only using the power flow, which is the 3D recharge equation, with the CLM, which is a land surface model. We always need to know all models are wrong, whether our predictions are good enough. So we are using multiple data sets as observations. So snow water equivalent data, evapotranspiration, stream flow gauging stations, and our multi-criteria assessment, both at a point scale and a spatial scale shows that the model capture hydrologic processes. Keep in mind that these models take a long time to run, so it's very difficult to implement any type of Monte Carlo or Bayesian approaches for model calibration. So our calibration approach actually is very limited. But since these models are physics-based, they could capture often the hydrologic processes very well. This figure here shows how using, so we used 3 different numerical experiments where in each experiment, we first use a single temperature data, which is the average of all available forcing that we have versus different P. And you can see how water budget partitioning is changing as a function of precipitation only, as a function of changing in temperature only, keeping precipitation constant, and changing both at the same time. As you can see, uncertainty in precipitation forcing create considerable uncertainty on the simulated water budget, particularly for ET and groundwater outflux from the watershed. And uncertainty in temperature further amplifies these types of uncertainty. Do we have a solution? We have a simple solution, but that's not the best approach. Through sets of numerical experiments, we showed that if we just take the average of all the available forcing data, our simulated results would be better relative to our observations. But really, we need to develop, instrument our catchments and improve our algorithms for better estimation of precipitation. But we need to move forward with this recharge estimation story. How the recharge from the mountains are changing. That's a big thing that we are interested in. As you can see, mountain block recharge is a small component of recharge that's happening in the basin, and majority of the recharge in this particular catchment is focused through mountain front recharge processes. And both rain and snow have creating about the same amount of recharge in the basin. And of course, when you are adding both uncertainty in precipitation and temperature, the uncertainty in recharge estimates also increases considerably. Why we get about the same ratios of amount of recharge MAR from rain or snow? Because actually in this particular catchment, the amount of rain is more than snow. So although the recharge efficiency of a snow is higher, the rates is about the same. Now we have an understanding of the impact of meteorological uncertainty. Let's see what happened during the latest drought that we have in 2012 to 2015, which was one of the most severe droughts on record. And here again, power flow CLM simulations. One interesting thing that happened, if you are looking at fraction of precipitation that was used for stream flow versus ET, we could see that the ET could be maintained during the drought, but we had substantial reduction on stream flow. And this is the result actually have been confirmed by Roger Bills and colleagues at UC Merced using observations. So at least we could trust that, okay, our modeling is doing a good job and mimics the observation. But the question is why stream flow declined so considerably? And since we are using a numerical model, we could look at the connectivity of saturated zone in the saprolite layer, which is that the weathered bedrock beneath the soil zone. And we see that during the drought, the connectivity of saturated region in the saprolite layer declines considerably, and that will impact the stream flow in Sierra Nevada, at least for this Covilla River watershed, which is highlighting that considering subsurface storage properties is important. But how much storage is lost in the system if we trust the model? I should mention that the model, this version, doesn't have irrigation or pumping. So this is just the function of actual forcing data that we are using in the model. Although we didn't have pumping in Central Valley, the amount of storage loss during the drought in Central Valley was high, as well as in the mountains, because we didn't have recharge due to a snowpack. Also, when we are looking at post-drought period between 2016 to 2019, you would see that although we don't have pumping in Central Valley, the storage that we lost during the drought hasn't been recovered even 1,400 days after the end of the drought. So I don't know, maybe Central Valley never recovered from the previous drought, and now we are facing another maybe severe drought ahead of us. What happens to the future of water availability and agriculture in the region? So our results also confirms a recent study that was published in Nature just a few months ago by Tim Peterson in Australia and colleagues that watersheds may not recover from drought. They've been using a stream flow data to look at, but here we are using groundwater observations as well as simulations, and we show that these response times and recovery time of subsurface storage could be very long. Let's move from Central Valley to Southern California, close to UC Riverside, looking at another important agricultural regions in the state, the Salton Sea watershed, where we are trying to explain how ecohydrologic processes of irrigated agriculture impacts lake groundwater interactions. Salton Sea is a transboundary watershed, has an area of about 21,000 square kilometers in an endorheic basin, meaning that majority of any water that actually comes to the Salton Sea drains to the lake. It's a very dry system. Mean annual precipitation is less than 150 millimeters. So the survival of agriculture in the basin essentially relies on Colorado River water that flows via all the American Canal to the US portion of the watershed. How the Salton Sea was generated, if you are looking at some records even from 1900, Salton Sea was created as a result of large flood on Colorado River. Actually, the sea level was increasing because with the expansion of agriculture and irrigation, so that was a good thing for the Salton Sea. But then, as the irrigation becomes more efficient, we observe that in recent years, there has been considerable decline in the Salton Sea levels, what happens is majority of the lake bed becomes exposed and a toxic dust is generated that has been impacting the health of communities around the sea. So here we could see that hydrologic processes, agriculture, droughts, how they interact together to impact the communities that are living near this area. And of course, there has been considerable decline in the lake levels, and we don't know what is causing the considerable decline. There hasn't been significant changes in the inflows to the lake if you are looking at records from 1980 until now. And the decline in the Salton Sea water level cannot be explained by decline in the inflows to the lake. So what is causing that? Of course, as a groundwater hydrologist, I always think there is a groundwater connection. So to answer this question, we set up a semi-distributed hydrologic model called Soil and Water Assessment Tool. And this model essentially is a very flexible and has options to include water management practices. We couldn't use something like Parflow CLM in this watershed. And of course, accurate estimation of water budget depends on a number of factors. First, this is an endorheic basin. It was very difficult even to delineate the watershed. We don't have publicly available specific irrigation data. So kind of we are using automated irrigation approaches to estimate. There are extensive canal network and drainages that we don't have a map of it. So we only include major canals in our modeling systems. Another challenge is part of this watershed is in Mexico. So there is a discrepancy between, you get land cover data, soil data from US versus what you get from Mexico. So we had to come up with, some strategies to create some sort of a uniform land cover data set across the border, as well as with the soil texture data set. This shows the results of model calibration from 1980 until now. So we use 70% of the data for model calibration. And as you can see, we have a lot of gauges that are around the Salton Sea, and we have to calibrate. But 3 of the gauges are the main ones that I'm going to talk about. So one is this Whitewater River that passes through the Coachella Valley, and the Alamo River and New River, because they provide 95% of water to the Salton Sea. As you can see, the model does a pretty good job considering all these irrigation, canals, drainages in simulating the hydrologic response. Whitewater River, not a very good job because here we have conjunctive use. Both surface water and groundwater is used for irrigation. We don't have this data. We cannot access to this data. So data sharing is a key by the agencies who are involved and managing these systems. But also this model could capture changes in lake water level dynamics. So now we could look at how the system is responding and what is the water budget of the lake for the first time. One thing, that component that has been neglected in the past 20 years of research in the Salton Sea is seepage from the lake to the groundwater. You could argue that our estimates are wrong. I agree, but there is still some seepage, and we are working on implementing other data sets to estimate these loss. So evaporation cannot solely explain the water budget of the lake, and the lake loses about 35% of its water to groundwater. But we need to do more. Don't quote me on these numbers. We are still working to improve these estimates, but at least this is what our model suggests, and we have good calibration of the flow records as well as the yield estimates. So simulating hydrologic budget of a highly managed watershed is challenging, and we don't have information about irrigation rates and water distribution systems. This requires partnership with the stakeholders to provide us with data, and saving the sea is a multifaceted problem, requires collaboration among various stakeholders to reduce land subsidence in Coachella Valley, maintain agricultural production, energy production, environmental flows for the ecosystems and habitats, as well as human health. There are a lot of increasing asthma cases in the region because the lake is shrinking and toxic dust impacting the health of human activities. What we have done about it, since about 1.5 years ago, we established a task force at for the Salton Sea by Professor Merlin Fogel, the director of the Edge Institute. And we have a report we'll be releasing by the end of this month, looking at the various aspects of the Salton Sea, not only hydrology, air quality, human health, water policy, geothermal, and so forth. In conclusion, characterizing watershed response to drought is complex. Hopefully you agree with me that watershed may not recover from droughts, and it takes much longer for groundwater to recover. Mountain system recharge processes are complex, but one of the main components of natural recharge to Central Valley aquifer systems, and we need a holistic approach to look at these types of processes. We need better subsurface characterization. Thankfully, the use of geophysical methods are encouraging. We need to integrate numerical modeling with geochemical tracers, and this is something that we are exploring at the moment in my lab with my new postdoctoral fellow, Dr. Sandra Armengol. And also we need to develop computational efficient approaches for long-term simulation and quantifying uncertainty. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Wow, thank you. That was quite something.
Thanks, Sophie.
Yeah, questions. It looks like Graham Fogg has a comment in the chat. Do you want to respond to that?
Let me just have a look. Yes, hi, Graham, good to see you.
We can talk about that another time if you wish.
But no, I agree that, yes, so changes in irrigation efficiency and drain flow has an impact, and that's a component that we are also trying to quantify. But the seepage from the lake hasn't been incorporated like in the models that the state is using for Salton Sea management plan. So that is something that we need to consider. I mean, for sure, we know there is no asphalt underneath the lake. So that is important. And I would love to chat to you more. I know you have been doing some modeling in the Coachella.
Yeah, a long time ago, and we still do some. But also on your Kauai work, I think that's also important from the standpoint of, there's an effort now to incorporate groundwater in GCMs and continental scale groundwater models. And one of the big problems, in my opinion, is you can kind of define the water table in the mountains based on lakes. If you can assume the lakes are an expression of the water table. But if that's true and you honor that estimate as the water table, it's very easy to have a model that moves far too much water from the highland to the lowland, unless the hydraulic conductivity of the mountain front and the mountains is just right. So what did you do to try and get at, a reasonable estimate of that, the hydraulic conductivity, the permeability of the mountains and the mountain front?
That's a very good question. So that's a big challenge. We don't have a good geology. And I always tell Rosemary Knight at Stanford, can you fly your helicopter a little bit up the mountain so we could have a better characterization of subsurface properties? At the moment, let's be honest, we are just guessing, and we are checking against flow and looking at, a snow water equivalent and things like that. However, we have hired a great isotope geochemist, and she has been looking at various data set, actually existing data set through Gamma program. And actually you talked about lake, and we think lake should have an impact. We see some sort of a signature at the moment. Very preliminary, it's just 1 month she's into this. But what our goal is, this is part of my NSF career proposal in the next 5 years, use groundwater tracers with conjunction the numerical model to better constrain this flow path. I presented some mountain block recharge estimate, but even I don't believe it because these are from the models. Yes.
I think it has to be calibrated based on an estimate of the water table slope from the highlands to the lowlands, but that data is really hard to get.
Yes, there is nothing there, and you know much better than me, which is very hard to get any data about groundwater in California. And I was talking with a colleague the other day and said, welcome to the California water bar. I didn't believe that it's to that extent. So that's why I'm also encouraging the collaborations, particularly with the universities. We are happy to help the water managers and the agencies to develop these programs. We're spending a lot of time. And then of course we don't have many, any wells, so we just have a sporadic, some geochemistry data from the uplands, and these areas are very important. So I hope to see investments maybe from the states to map these areas and looking at these recharge sources from the mountains.
Well, the data is a lot better than it used to be, if you can believe it.
Yeah.
This year is much better. The Sigma portal has been very much improved. Yes.
Yeah, not to mention that these are the areas that are most sensitive to drought and lots of water supply, right? Unfortunately, yeah, there's not much data. So I guess just moving on to the next question. It says precipitation events are characterized as short-term high-intensity events in arid lands where there is a shortage of time for water to enter soil layers. So most of water generates surface flow or runoff. Would that impact groundwater recharge and recovery? If so, how to effectively mitigate the impact?
That's a good question. It impacts groundwater recharge. The modeling framework that we are using, it runs at an hourly time step. So we could, to some degree, incorporate the impact of these extreme events. And actually, another work that we did in New Mexico, which I didn't present here, we show that those high intensity rainfall events actually are most productive ones for creating recharge. So there's a paper published in Environmental Research Letters that also validated with observations that we could look at. So yes, those extreme events are also important and could provide opportunity for recharge, particularly at the mountain front.
Yeah, the next question is, can you comment on the role of satellite data in your research? How much data do you use? What resolution? And is this currently a bottleneck in your processing pipeline? And you have been talking about this, so anything more to add?
Yes, so we have been using like Moody's ET product and the snow water equivalent product that is a kind of a data fusion product from Landsat data. The biggest challenge is the spatial resolution as well as the temporal resolution. And then, then finally gets to the processing aspect of the satellite data to bring it to our model. And one thing that we need to consider, these are not actual observations. These are some sort of a measure of reflectance, and we need to convert those to relevant biophysical variables. So those are the challenges that with the satellite. So the short, the bottom line answer, we need high resolution, both spatially and temporally.
Just a follow up on that. Did you use Sentinel data? Because this is available at higher resolution. I know its time span is slightly shorter because it started recently. But did you start using it or consider using it?
We haven't used it, but of course we are planning to use it in the future. And thank you, Ahmad. I should realize that it is from you. Yes, we haven't used it, but we plan, as well as planet data with these new USDA NIFA grant at UCR, better integrate higher resolution data set. But often, some of these are raw data. We need to create products like new ET products from Sentinel data or the snow water equivalent data from Sentinel, which takes a long time to develop the algorithms to do it. Thanks.
Any additional questions, thoughts? Yeah, Kurt, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Great talk, Ori. I wanted to go back to Graham's question, and I think that what was always perplexing to me when I was talking with IID people about the flows going into the sea was they would always say, listen, the drainage flows are constant from 2013-3 to 2017. You know, so nothing's happening with the lake, but you were showing that the lake was actually going down, even though the drain inflows due to efficiency or land fallowing, it was being mitigated by the mitigation water. So I think the importance of your work is showing that, listen, there's groundwater inflows that aren't getting there due to the efficiency, things that you can't measure with those drainage flows. And there's maybe loss due to seepage through the bottom of the lake or something like that. Is that right?
Right. And I hope that IID could share those drain flows with us so we could further, validate our model. I should say that this is not the best model to use. I mean, I know many of us, or Safik also, have used SWOT quite a bit, but actually it's the best tool in the toolbox for these types of systems. And hopefully if we could secure more funding, we are thinking to add mud flow to it, because I'm thinking these lake groundwater interactions is an important component. And we are doing a lot of tricks with SWOT to represent Salton Sea. But these results actually came out half an hour before my talk from the second version of the model, so it's fresh.
Great, thanks. And
Thank you.
Just when you were doing your calibration for the relationship between, mountain flows and drought and the response to groundwater, it's interesting how you chose that 95% or the 5% kind of values. Did you do any robustness checks on that to see? I mean, imagine that if you had precipitation going down, but it didn't hit that 5% level for a while, like it was 6% for a couple of years. Was there a way to maybe see how sensitive your results were to that kind of
that's a good question. I should be honest that we have difficulty publishing that paper. It's very difficult to, yes, we did some checks to see how sensitive our results are, but note that we are also looking at very long droughts, because if we, lower our threshold, these start to find a lot of droughts in precipitation and then not find the corresponding droughts. So the biggest challenge, although we wrote the code, was to associate the drought that we see in precipitation time series to groundwater time series and link them. So, but the lag time, that based on the checks that we have done, is not sensitive to, that much sensitive to the choice of the threshold. But yes, that's one of the limitations. So we just say, this is what we selected. This is for particular droughts. Yeah.
Thank you. Really enjoyed this.
Thank you.
Okay, we have 1 more minute. So I'm going to ask the last question. I was really intrigued by the attribution on the lag time and the recovery of the groundwater system. And I was just curious if you saw, maybe I missed it, if you saw any signal of climate warming on either, in terms of kind of, the lag time or the rate of recovery moving forward.
Temperature, so I kind of quickly pass over it. Temperature also had an impact. So maybe if I share my screen to show that figure that shows the controls between water table depth and different physical and geographic properties. That could reveal that, yes, temperature also have an impact. We didn't look at the warming trends per se, but let me show here. So here, for example, when we are developing the regression model, the purple crosses shows when we are including elevation, canopy cover, and air temperature. And the brown crosses is when we are including, recharge, aquifer properties. So at shallow depth, actually temperature also plays an important control on the lag time. And then here is the importance factors for the lag time. You could see that, yes, after recharge, actually the air temperature also has an impact. It has the second largest impact. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. Any last minute thoughts? If not, then let's collectively thank Hoori for giving this excellent talk. And we'll take a summer break and we'll resume our webinar in the fall. So, keep your, inbox, checking for the future announcement. So thank you, Hoori.
Thank you so much, Safik, and everyone for staying and great questions, and look forward to collaborate or answer any questions if you have. Please feel free to contact me. Thank you so much and have a great Friday afternoon.